Hello, everybody, and happy Wednesday. I am Jax James, your state policy manager at NORML, here to chat with y'all about what is going on across the country with newly filed and moving legislation. So let's kick it off. But first off, I do want to acknowledge the election that happened yesterday in Oklahoma. Last I looked, with 100% of the precincts reporting, it does look like that proposal failed, with 38% voting yes and 62% voting no. So an adult retail regulated market in Oklahoma did not pass this time around. It's interesting to see if that, as we kind of unpack it, has to do with it being a standalone item on the ballot or what. So unfortunately, that's the news on Oklahoma today. But we have some really great news in other states. So that's nice to be able to pivot to. As you guys know, legislation continues to advance in multiple states. And the way I'll kind of go through everything today is, first I'll talk about legalization, then I'll talk about decrim, medical access. We'll talk about some additional legislation that we follow, and even a few that we are opposing. So let's go ahead and kick it off discussing legalization. So in Delaware, if you have been following what has been going on in Delaware, you know there has been a long fight there to get the adult use of cannabis available to those 21 and older. There are two bills this session: HB 1, which removes all penalties for the possession of a personal amount of cannabis for those that are over the age of 21. Of course, public consumption would remain an unclassified misdemeanor. Personal use quantity in this is defined as 1 ounce or less of leaf cannabis, 12 grams or less of concentrates or cannabis containing 750 milligrams or less of Delta 9 THC. So that's HB 1, and HB 1 has now passed the House 28-13. It has moved over to the Senate and been assigned to the Senate Health and Social Services Committee. Now, HB 2 would have to do with the infrastructure of that, legalized market in Delaware, and we are hopeful that it will have a vote on the House floor this Thursday. So definitely let your senators and your representatives know in Delaware that you support this legislation. And it's hopefully going to make it across the finish line this year. Now, in Hawaii, there's several bills having to do with legalization, but the one that's really moving is SB 669, and it legalizes personal cultivation and small amounts of cannabis. This has now passed the Senate and heads over to the House. So great news in Hawaii. That was one of our states to watch, that we are hopeful that we can get that across the finish line there. Now, in Maryland, there are two bills known as the Cannabis Omnibus Bills, HB 556 and Senate Bill 516, which would allow for those 21 and up to consume on site at certain places that have licensing for that, consume in a social setting. It creates that regulatory framework around the referendum that passed in November. And the legislation also institutes certain parental and personal protections for both medical and adult use consumers. Another interesting note is that the bills will increase the amount of cannabis that a registered medical patient can possess from 4 ounces of flower and 36 grams of THC infused concentrates and 4 plants for home cultivation. So currently there is not an allowance for home cultivation for patients. So these are some really great improvements. And the update here is that HB 556 was amended and passed the House Committee on Economic Matters. SB 516 is scheduled for a hearing in the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow on the 9th. So definitely, if you live in Maryland, participate in that action alert there. Another state that we qualified at the beginning of the year as a must-watch state is Minnesota. There's some companion bills, HF 100 and SF 73, that would allow adults to purchase 2 ounces of cannabis and to home cultivate up to 8 plants. It also creates a system of licensed private retail cannabis businesses where municipalities and counties could also own and operate governmental dispensaries. Those with prior marijuana convictions would be able to have their records automatically expunged. The legislation also allows for on-site consumption lounges and cannabis delivery services. Additionally, it's of note that it does contain language banning the sale of unregulated synthetic cannabinoids, which is consistent with the Board of Pharmacy rules that were put into place last year. So those of you in Minnesota, I know you've been watching really closely and really engaging in this action alert. What's been going on is both of the bills have to pass 12. That's right. 12 committees from their respective chamber before they go to a floor vote. When I checked this morning, HF 100 had passed 11 of those committees in the House, and SF 73 had passed 10 committees in the Senate. So we're getting closer to hopefully having some floor votes in Minnesota, but definitely continue to engage with your legislators. So with these last few committee hearings, they know how you want them to vote on the matter. Now, in New Hampshire, there's a couple bills I want to highlight here, 3 bills in particular. The first is HB 639. It would allow 21 and up to purchase, possess, and gift up to 4 ounces of cannabis. The newly named Liquor and Cannabis Commission, would be responsible for regulating the market and issuing business license, and it would be subject to an 8.5 meal and room tax. So HB 639 was amended and passed the House Commerce and Consumer Affairs Committee. Members of the House Ways and Means Committee will now consider the bill, and if they approve it, it will go to the floor for a vote. The next bill I want to highlight is HB 360, which legalizes the possession and use of cannabis for those 21 and up, basically by just striking all references to cannabis or marijuana from the state's Controlled Drug Act, therefore amending statutes to provide safe and legal possession and consumption for those of 21 and up. So HB 360 is in committee and is expected to have a vote by the 16th of this month. So within the next week or two, we should be able to see that bill moving. The last bill in New Hampshire that I want to highlight is HB 344. Now, the amendment to the previous bill I mentioned, 639, was to remove home cultivation. What 344 does is that it would permit adults to possess 3/4 ounce of cannabis, 5 grams of hash, and infused products. It would also legalize home cultivation of up to 6 plants. So this is definitely an important component of a regulated adult use market. And HB 344 has been what's called retained by the committee, which basically means that there will be no further action taken this year. Rather, they will take action on it as one of the first items of business in the next year of their biennium, because they have that kind of cycle set up there in New Hampshire. So 3 bills moving there. I know, and those of you in New Hampshire have been watching the roller coaster ride there, wondering when you will be able to join most of those other northeastern states who have the adult use of cannabis available. So let's pivot to talking about decriminalization. So in Texas, my home state, this last week, or last Tuesday, so not yesterday, but a week ago before that, HB 218 was held for a hearing in the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. The author, Joe Moody, is also the chair of the committee. And what this bill does is it reduces penalty possession for 1 ounce or less of flour or concentrate, also instructing officers to no longer make arrests for the personal amount of marijuana or its related paraphernalia. Additionally, it facilitates a process for the expungement of past marijuana charges. So the great news here is that HB 218 unanimously passed the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. So we are really stoked to see that happening in Texas. There's an action alert there for you. In Texas, just so you know, if you're watching from that state, or my state is what we'll say, there are quite a few bills that are all being referred to committee now. You'll start to see more and more of them referred. There's several dozen bills that have been filed. About 2/3 of them have been referred to committee. And this is the first one to have a hearing. So we look forward to having additional hearings on medical cannabis and other topics in the coming weeks. So speaking of medical cannabis, let's talk about medical access across the country. So first in Arizona, there's Senate Bill 1466, which would include PTSD and autism spectrum as qualifying conditions, while also reducing the cost for applying for and receiving a medical access registration card, making it free for veterans. So the good news here is that SB 1466 has passed the Senate 24-6. So good news for veterans and those with autism, or anyone who lives with PTSD and autism in Arizona. So in Georgia, newly filed legislation, SB 270, authorizes and regulates the issuance of licenses for the production and distribution of low THC cannabis products. It also adds ulcerative colitis to the list of qualifying conditions. So under current law in Georgia, people who live there are allowed to access low THC cannabis extracts, but there are yet to be any open dispensaries to provide this legal source for Georgian patients. So definitely participate in that action alert if you live in Georgia. Now, talking about Oregon, HB 3567 adds palliative care and comprehensive pain management to the list of qualifying conditions for the use of medical cannabis. It also instructs entities that provide this type of care to allow for the use of medical cannabis products in said facilities. Further, it protects nurses from termination for the discussing of cannabis with their patients. So some great additions and protections happening in Oregon. So in South Dakota, there is SD1. It's a bit of a mixed bag. So what it does is it authorizes medical cannabis access for quite a few new conditions: AIDS, HIV, ALS, multiple sclerosis, cancer its treatment, severe pain, nausea, vomiting, wasting, Crohn's disease, epilepsy, seizures, PTSD. A pretty great list of additions there for South Dakota. However, it also limits patients and other third parties from petitioning in the future to add additional qualifying conditions. Now, the update here is that differing versions of SD1 have passed both chambers. So the bill will now go to a conference committee where they will concur on any changes before it then heads to the governor's desk. So moving on to some other bills that we want to highlight from across the country. These are on a varying array of topics. We'll start with Alaska. HB 28 reduces the barriers to employment for those that have been convicted with low-level marijuana possession charges that were legal as of January 1, 2024. If passed, the bill would prohibit the release of conviction records from the court system or any other agency, and it would also purge records for these convictions from publicly accessible records. So the update at HB 28 is that it is scheduled for a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee today. So if you are in Alaska, definitely click on that link and participate in our action alert there. A couple bills in California are moving. First is SB 28, which authorizes local jurisdictions to allow for the preparation or sale of non-cannabis food or beverage products by licensed retailers or micro businesses in the area where the consumption of cannabis is allowed. So the update here is it is going to be scheduled for a hearing in the Senate Business, Professions, and Economic Development Committee in April, on April 17th. So it's a little far out there, but definitely you've got plenty of warning to get that, click that link in the blog today and participate in that action alert. Additionally, there is in California SB 51, which would authorize the Department of Cannabis Control to issue provisional licenses for local cannabis equity applicants so that retail activities for up to 5 years. The applicant does have to meet certain requirements by the department, but SB 51 has now been scheduled for a hearing in the Senate Business, Professions, and Economic Development Committee at the end of this month on March 27th. So definitely some good heads up there in California. I encourage you guys to engage with California NORML there and tune into everything they've got going on. Now, newly filed legislation in Florida, SB 972 and its companion HB 1063, want to protect the rights of public employees who use medical cannabis. The bill would prohibit public employers from taking adverse action like refusing to hire, firing someone, discriminating against qualified medical patients, all with the caveat that all possible attempts to mitigate the situation have been made should the employee's use of cannabis pose some kind of safety issue. So an alert there for you guys in Florida. Illinois has a couple of bills that are moving right now. The first is HB 1462, which would create regulations for the expungement of records relating to past convictions of marijuana possession. And that bill is scheduled for a hearing in the House Judiciary and Criminal Committee, or it was, I'm sorry, as of yesterday, and it is currently pending a vote. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have that vote for you shortly. Additional Illinois legislation, HB 1205, prohibits the police from citing the odor of marijuana for probable cause for searching a home, vehicle, or property. Another bill, Senate Bill 125, prohibits the odor of burnt or raw cannabis emanating from a motor vehicle from being considered probable cause for a search. So HB 1205 is scheduled for a hearing today in the House Executive Committee, and SB 125 is scheduled for a hearing in the Senate Special Committee on Criminal Law and Public Safety tomorrow. So Illinois, make sure you participate in those action alerts today. Now, in Maine, we've got legislative document 839, which would permit cannabis businesses to establish on-site cannabis consumption spots in designated areas with which are separate from the location or room where the cannabis is actually being purchased. So LD 839 is scheduled for a hearing in the House Committee on Veteran and Legal Affairs on the 13th of this month. So definitely an opportunity to show your support before that upcoming hearing. So I mentioned the bills in Maryland to create that legal structure surrounding the referendum that passed, but there's some other legislation moving. SB 671 and HB 1172 allow out-of-state medical cannabis patients to access their medication while visiting Maryland, something called reciprocity. And this bill, the House version, is scheduled for hearing as of yesterday. I have not seen a vote come through yet, so we are pending the outcome of that, but hopefully that bill will advance. Additionally, we've got HB 232, which amends the state's child neglect laws so that it excludes the use of cannabis in certain instances. And SB 653 seeks to protect patients who legally use cannabis from the prosecution of child neglect. The bill codifies into law that neglect does not include the use of cannabis by a parent or individual who has permanent or temporary custody or responsibility of supervision of the child. Now, the House version 232 has passed the House 134-1, and SB 653 is scheduled for a hearing in the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee on the 15th of this month. Now, in New Mexico, we've got HB 314 having to do with expungement, expunging records of anyone charged with an offense prior to the adoption of the Cannabis Regulation Act. And this bill has passed out of the House and now heads to the Senate. So make sure if you live in New Mexico, you let your senator know that you support this important expungement legislation. In New York, there's newly filed legislation, SB 5293, that would prohibit employers from mandating future hires take a marijuana drug screening test as a condition of employment. Of course, as we typically see, there are some exceptions for those that work in police or law enforcement jobs, public transportation, certain types of safety jobs, those that have a commercial driver's license, but still definitely an important change for people in New York. In Oregon, we've got HB 3428, which prohibits public healthcare employees from denying employment or taking adverse employment action against an individual based on a positive test for cannabis. The bill provides circumstances where a public healthcare employer may take adverse employment action against an individual, but only if it's reasonably suspected that they are impaired at work. Additionally, the bill requires the state to conduct studies related to marijuana use and the detection of impairment. Now, in Utah, we've got SB 293, which seeks to revise provisions related to expungement of arrest and conviction records in Utah. This bill basically decreases the waiting period once a person submits an appeal for expungement. Of course, this varies upon the offense and subsequent ruling, but if they can establish that the amount of cannabis in question was within current parameters of possession limits under Utah Medical Cannabis Program, then they can obtain a retroactive certification of affliction with the condition at the time of the offense. So this bill has passed the House and the Senate and now heads to the governor's desk. So definitely check out that link. Let the governor know that you do support this legislation in Utah. Now, last bill that is going to be in this section is Washington, HB 1563, and this provides protections for medical cannabis users in Washington. If past qualifying patients who hold a valid authorization but have not been entered into the database and have not therefore gotten their card, would still be protected from arrest. And this bill has passed the House 63-32. Now let's talk about a few bills that we oppose across the country. Let's start with Kentucky, newly filed legislation SB 228 imposes an arbitrary 5 nanogram THC per se limit for drivers. NORML opposes these limits because the presence of THC in the blood is not a consistent indicator of recent cannabis use or impairment. So definitely click to oppose that effort in Kentucky. Now, in New York, we've got Assembly Bill 4934, which would ban the sale and delivery of THC products in certain candy forms, such as chocolates or gummies. Last bit of legislation I want to highlight today is in South Dakota. HB 1053 and SB 3 seek to specifically exclude pregnant and breastfeeding women from being issued medical cannabis cards. Unfortunately, this bill has passed the House and the Senate, but please do go ahead and reach out to the governor of South Dakota opposing this effort to restrict the medical freedom of those that are pregnant or breastfeeding. So it's a lot going on across the country, as you guys can see. And in the description of this live stream, we've got the blog from today that you can click on, check out all those action alerts and details. But if you didn't hear a bill from your state today, that doesn't mean that there's not legislation pending in your state. So I definitely encourage you to go to norml.org/act. At the top, you'll see a couple of our federal action alerts, and then below you'll see a map of the United States. If you hover your cursor over your state, it will pop up every bill that is currently moving in the area that you live in. Speaking of the area that you live in, if you are not yet engaged with a local NORML chapter, I encourage you to check out the link in the stream where you can find out if there is a chapter near you. If there's not, there's also a way that you can apply to become a chapter leader. So definitely look into that. And as always, I want to remind everybody that NORML is a consumer and patient advocacy group, been around for decades now, working to change marijuana law reform. And the work that we do is funded by people just like you, people making small one-time or reoccurring donations, people who become members or purchase things through our shop. So I definitely included all those links for you guys as well, so that you can also support NORML during this crunch time legislatively. So I want to thank you all for tuning in today. It's an exciting and busy update for sure. I look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday. Hopefully we'll have some more great news for advancing legislation for you. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful week.